Our journey begins in the late 60s. It was a time when everything seemed possible. The Beatles sang "All You Need Is Love." The Apollo space mission was getting ready to land a man on the moon. And even Peter's beloved Toronto Maple Leafs had won the Stanley Cup, a break from tradition since they've never won it again. So at the time, our family lived on the outskirts of Toronto, Canada. My mother and father had emigrated from the Mediterranean island of Malta, where their childhood, unfortunately, had been interrupted by air raid sirens and severe rations of World War II. So they were prevented from getting an education, and when they came to Canada, they wanted to ensure that the environment for their kids was one in which there was stability and an opportunity to get a good education. So we had a very fun childhood in Toronto. We played street hockey, as Carol mentioned, with our friends Mike Clemec and Rob Wilson. We caught turtles in the local ponds, and we got together with our many relatives. So it was a great time. But it was evident very early on that Peter had a way with numbers. He loved math, and he would have us test him on his ability to do mental calculations. And this came in really handy when we sat down to play his favorite game, which was Monopoly. Peter would always be the banker. He'd enjoy figuring out, the transactions and explaining to his younger brothers how mortgages worked and things of that nature. It was the first inkling that we thought that Peter was deemed for a career in Wall Street. But after mastering Monopoly, he wanted to see whether he could actually make money in the real world. And so in those days, opportunities were somewhat limited for a 13-year-old. And Peter one day saw the local newspaper boy deliver a paper to our house. And the idea hit him that he was being paid for each paper he delivered and walking from house to house, sometimes in the cold and the rain. And Peter thought, there's got to be a better way. And he reasoned, if I had a newspaper route in an apartment building, I could go up, set the elevator to go to the top floor, get out, throw the papers out to each of the places, each of the apartments, and then run back in before the elevator doors closed, go down to the next floor and do the same thing. Rinse and repeat. And so Peter, next thing you know, Peter gets the biggest building he could find in the neighborhood, and he puts this into effect. And lo and behold, it worked. He could deliver far more papers in the apartment building than he could in a neighborhood, and he could stay warm at the same time. So what happened next is Peter, of course, being the enterprising individual that he was, expanded his operation into multiple buildings. And he even enlisted my help as his first employee. And together, he built this paper route empire that became the biggest paper route in all of Canada. Go figure. And eventually he tired of it, and he, of course, sold the route at a profit. But he gave one of the paper routes to me, and I was able to make a few dollars on the side as a result of it. And, to me, that was kind of a story that showed Peter's mind for business, for developing innovative approaches, and for helping others like myself to succeed. And he had also proven that he could make money in the real world, not just in Monopoly. So, as you know, Peter also had a passion for academia. And this, too, has its roots in his childhood. So my father, who's flown in with my family and myself from LA to be here today, likes to tell the story about Peter and his favorite TV show at the time, which was Gilligan's Island. Now, I realize that many of you probably don't know that TV show, is really about sort of the antics of 7 castaways who get stranded on this island off of Hawaii and try to make it back to the mainland. But there's a character on Gilligan's Island called the Professor. And the Professor had this profound impact on Peter. Peter was inspired by the Professor's encyclopedic memory or knowledge, how the Professor would write these long equations on a blackboard that somehow they acquired in the middle of that island. And the Professor also loved all these gadgets, that he'd make these gadgets to try to get them off the island. And so he was so enthralled by that when my father would ask Peter, what do you want to be when you grow up? And granted, Peter was just a little tiny tot at the time. He'd look up, and without skipping a beat, he'd say, a processor. He couldn't even, pronounce the word, but he had a clear ambition of what his future career was going to be at that time. So I just wanted to sort of say that it's no wonder that later in Peter's career we would find him with the same encyclopedic knowledge, filling blackboards with equations and playing with some newfangled gadgets, as Carol had mentioned. So thank you, Gilligan's Island, for providing the incredible role model that would serve Peter down the road to academia. So fast forward a few years on this magical mystery tour, and we get to Peter's formal education. In high school, he made friends very easily and quickly became one of the top students. He especially loved math and finance, go figure. And as Carol mentioned, he eventually did a Bachelor's of Commerce degree and an MBA at the University of Toronto. And Peter had a strong influence on the careers of many people, myself included. He was an important factor in my own decision to complete a commerce degree at the same university and eventually complete an MBA. And Peter's enthusiasm and passion were contagious to many, including myself. Carol also mentioned that after he completed his MBA, he had moved down to LA to pursue his PhD and found this place in Bel Air. But there's actually kind of a fun story associated with that. And Peter loved to tell this story. So the story is that he left our home in Toronto to move to LA in the sort of beat up 1970s VW Rabbit that we had. He had packed all of his belongings in the Rabbit, nicely organized in boxes and labeled and all that sort of thing that Peter loves to do. But unfortunately, he ran into a problem along the way where his car was vandalized and broken into while he slept at night, and everything was taken from his car, all of his worldly possessions, his books, his clothes, everything that he didn't have with him at the time. But Peter, not being one to allow a thief to get in the way of his dreams, continued on, now in an empty VW Rabbit, to LA, where his luck started to change for the better. He saw this ad in a paper for this place in Bel Air. And of course, for those of you who may not be aware, Bel Air is a very exclusive neighborhood near UCLA, so it's just perfect. And as a student, he could afford it, but there were a couple of strings attached. And so he called up the person who put the ad in the paper, and she said, yeah, come meet with me later this afternoon, later this afternoon, and let's talk about it. So Peter being one to jump at the opportunity, made that appointment. But the only problem was that he didn't have any suitable clothes. They'd all been stolen, from his car. So he decided to go on this mission and get some clothes. He got a new, pressed shirt, pants, a belt. He had to get his clothes tailored. He had to find somebody, who could tailor them on the spot. He even went and got a haircut. And then as the sun was setting, he drove up, to the road to this lady's house. And he was surprised that it was dark. And he knocked on the door and heard nothing. And he waited. And then he knocked again, and he was thinking, did I get the address wrong, or what's going on? And then slowly the door opened, and it was dark inside, and out of the darkness came this woman, wearing dark glasses with this white cane. And Peter realized that here he was, he spent the whole day getting these clothes, this haircut, for this blind woman. And the irony of the whole situation just caused him to break down and laugh. And of course, he told the story to the lady, and she laughed too, and they had this tremendous relationship. It was the start of a wonderful, warm relationship for the two of them for many years. I thought that story was just, a tribute to Peter's adaptability, his determination, his resourcefulness, and just his warm sense of humor and ability to draw people towards him. So fast forward again, and over the ensuing years after he had moved out, we'd keep in touch, get together, our families would get together for holidays and vacations. And of course, Peter would go on to do great things in industry and academia. But the seeds had been sown all those years earlier in the experiences that we had growing up as kids, playing board games or building paper routes. And in our 30s and 40s, my brothers and I would get together, and inevitably we'd pull out the Monopoly game. Peter would once again be the banker. We'd watch old TV shows. We'd turn on, reruns of Gilligan's Island and watch a hockey game. Regrettably, the Leafs never did win the Stanley Cup again, but Peter, ever the optimist, never lost hope. And so now we arrive at the final stop of this Magical Mystery Tour, and it's been a wonderful journey. But all journeys eventually end, and unfortunately this one did too. The last month has been very difficult. As we process the loss of Peter, and I miss his passion, his brilliance, his infectious smile, his love of life, and his generosity. But I wanted to end with a quote that recently spoke to me about Peter and his influence on all of us, to celebrate his life and legacy. And the quote is, "A life well lived leaves others better off." And so, Peter, on behalf of the many people in this room and the people watching on Zoom and all those who've been touched by you, I just want to say thank you for leaving us all a little better off. And I want to say thank you to all of you as well for honoring my brother today. So,
excuse me, I'm up in the video. I think we've just received the video from Lauren. I can try to run it.
Oh.
Would you like me to try?
Okay. There's a little story behind this.
Hang on one second.
Which is that my brother Lawrence, but just before you turn that on for a moment, my brother Lawrence, who lives in France with his family, had planned to be here today, but unfortunately his family and himself came down with COVID the last week, which prevented them from traveling. And so he's put together this video And we would be honored if you take a few moments and listen to it. I was getting prepared to read the words that he had actually sent me. In the event that the video didn't arrive in time because they're in the French countryside, they started the upload yesterday evening.
And it finished about 30 seconds ago.
And it finished 30 seconds ago.
My wife Florence, son Clovis, and myself had planned to be with all of you on this important occasion, but this week we all came down with the COVID virus. I'm very grateful to Carol and her technical team so that I can be with you via this recording and say a few words about my elder brother, Peter. All three of us brothers, Peter, Jim, and myself, went to the same high school in Toronto, and its Latin motto, Semper Ad Excellentiam, quickly became engraved in our memories. Peter embodied that noble maximum in a very natural way. Always strive towards excellence. And yet, he had his own unique way of doing things, and I'm sure he would have amended that maximum to say, strive towards excellence, but with a touch of humor as well. Many of the people in this room know Professor Carr for his many accomplishments in the field of finance, but as his brother, I remember him in a more personal way, for the many times that he, as a young man, showed excellence in all that he did. It was just a natural part of his character, like a gift from birth, and there were many times in which he distinguished himself from the time he was a child. He always did so with natural grace and not a little laughter. Whenever my dad speaks of Peter as a preschooler, even today my 88-year-old father recalls how Peter learned to speak quite early, and that he could name every one of the scale model cars that were in his collection. As a 4-year-old child, Peter was already showing a remarkable talent for memory. Peter shared with his best friend, Mike Clemec, a real passion for sports. As Mike later recalled in his tribute to Peter, I'll always remember the day that we played all the local jocks and athletes of the school. We were both rather nervous. As it turned out, we ended up beating them. I had the game of my life in net, and Peter razzle-dazzled them all with his footwork and stick handling. But in his more solitary moments, Peter could relax by playing snooker on the billiard table in the basement. The family house had a billiard table because the original Caruana house in Malta was situated next door to a sports club, where his father and uncles often played pool before they emigrated to Canada. Peter kept up this family tradition by becoming a very proficient player in the game. I think it appealed to his mathematical side, since he would view the table from a variety of angles and plan his shots many moves ahead, always lining up the white ball for the next perfect shot. An uncle who was highly skilled in the game, Uncle Mike, often came by to challenge him. And in this way, Peter learned the Maltese style of playing international snooker with all its hooks and angles. Eventually, they participated in the Maltese Canadian Club competition, and Peter came away with first prize, accompanied by a large golden trophy surmounted by a billiard player. Semper Ad Excellentiam. All of these skills served him well during his academic studies, and he completed a Bachelor of Commerce degree with very high standing. This garnered him a position at Coopers & Lybrand, and it was his intention at the time to become a chartered accountant. This was Peter's first big step into the world of business, and we marveled at his transformation, since he now dressed in a pinstripe suit and came home with a big briefcase of ledgers and even changed his name from Caruana to Carr. I'd moved out of the family home by then, but I remember having dinner with him one evening at Cafe May in Toronto. And he explained to me with great excitement all his new duties as an auditor. But I came away from that dinner wondering if he was really on the right career path. Well, to give Peter his due, he soon realized that as well. Within a year, he'd give up on accounting and was pursuing graduate studies at the U of T. This is an important quality about my brother, which we should not overlook. Throughout his life, he had an unusual willingness to change his career path from industry to academia and then back again. Over the years, I watched at a distance as his life became more complete, marrying the love of his life, having a beautifully gifted child, and growing together into a happy family in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Somehow, each time we met up, he was either advancing in his career on Wall Street or publishing new papers and teaching part-time at places like NYU. He always managed to keep a foot in both camps, industry and academia. I believe he was genuinely intrigued by both, rising to the challenge of each and seeking excellence in both. As many of you know, Peter gave up some very lucrative opportunities on Wall Street to return to academia full-time as chair of Tandon's Department of Finance and Risk Engineering. This last change in his career path is, I believe, one of the most beautiful and noteworthy aspects of his legacy. He'd certainly left his mark in the field of finance, and we can see that from the many honors and prizes awarded to him and by the different pricing models and formulas bearing his name. But in the last decade of his life, he chose to dedicate himself to mathematics and finance in a different way by dedicating himself to others. He had a profound impact on the lives of his colleagues and students, those people who would, in turn, form the next generation of finance and risk engineering. Even before he left us, he was looking into the future and into the hearts of those people he knew and trusted to be the true bearers of his legacy. Those who, like him, were in pursuit of excellence in all that they did, but also with a little smile, a twinkle of the eye, and a touch of humor in their hearts. Thank you for remembering my brother, Peter Carr.
Our next good words will come from Dilip Madan, Lauren Wu, Sudeep Gupta, Raphael Duadi, and Philip Prater.
So we all know and remember Peter really as an embodiment of the celebration of life. But he left us, saddened and shocked, on the morning of March 1. I spoke with him on January 29th, asking how I hadn't heard from him on a discussion that we had had at a seminar on January 25. He usually responds fairly quickly. And he replied that he had not been feeling well and would get back to me when he was better. This was the first time, and now also the last time, that Peter had responded in such a manner. Undoubtedly, he leaves us with many wonderful memories of our interactions with him, and here I relate some of them. I first met him in the summer of '91 at a Cornell conference that initiated the journal Mathematical Finance. At the time, I had just arrived back to the US from 12 years in Australia and was unknown in the financial mathematics community of the United States. We had a brief meeting, but we got to appreciate each other, and we got to know each other much better later in the fall of '95, when I spent my fall semester on sabbatical at Cornell. And we pursued many discussions on esoteric matters of arbitrage pricing theory. By the summer of '96, Peter had left Cornell and come to New York as head quant of the group at Morgan Stanley. He may not have been the head, but was recognized by his brilliance, intellect, and energy as such by those around him. His natural inclination was to question, debate, and challenge whatever is being discussed from multiple directions in the friendliest way possible. Recognizing this, the rest of the team just fell in place, and he was the go-to person for any question, any item, anything to be done. He arranged to have me hired as a consultant at Morgan Stanley in the summer of '96. At that time, I was staying at my brother's place and driving into New York. And after the summer, I said, Peter, you know, these drives are a bit challenging. And so he wrote in my contract, plus expenses. And from then on, I stayed at the hotel across the street at Morgan Stanley and took the train up, and all covered by Morgan Stanley. The spring of '95 saw the birth of the variance gamma model that Peter and I had built. And in the firm, there were issues with trader overrides of models, leading to problems with capital requirements for the options business. So we proposed marking the books to the variance gamma model. They tested it out on a small set of securities, and then they decided that this was the model that they're going to use firm-wide for marking all their books all over the world. The marking activity, however, required fast computation of prices, and there was a whole team of 10, 15 people working, trying to figure out what's a good, fast way of doing these calculations. And I remember it must have been Thanksgiving of '96, when my family and I would go up to Connecticut to my brother-in-law's place on the Thursday, and on the Friday, the family came down to New York to go shopping. But neither I nor Peter was interested in shopping, and we would meet in the office at Morgan Stanley, and we worked there on building the fast Fourier transform method for pricing options. And the variance gamma model and this fast Fourier transform method are the two most cited papers of myself with Peter, and it actually made the marking of the prices of the options around the world possible, because without the fast computation, there was no way of actually doing this. Many people asked Peter to take charge of the model and its implementation. Own it. It's your thing. Live with it. But Peter's active mind could not stay in one place like that and had to move on to other pastures. He could not stand in the light of any past glories. He kept moving. Since then, we have worked in many ways and places. Carol mentioned a number of places. I've worked with him in Sydney, Budapest, Paris, London, numerous occasions. And when it comes to financial mathematics, Peter's mind does not take breaks. And there's a lovely story once on the Barrier Reef in Australia, when most of the conference party was taking dives and snorkeling in the Barrier Reef. Peter could be seen on deck, laptop in hand, interviewing colleagues on matters of mathematical detail. Apart from papers and presentations, Peter gave freely of his time in delivering courses at conferences during the years that he was in the industry. And the structure of the industry rules were that, the people that you're giving the course to are charging fees and wish to reward you for that and pay you some compensation. But Peter could not take such compensation. Those were the rules with the firms. And so he would direct the funds to various sources, one of which was Peter funding my fellowship conference in 2006. My 60th birthday conference was Peter funded it. Let me close by noting that there is much to fondly remember Peter by. I remember a night in Paris when we wanted to go to dinner at a restaurant where there's no menu and you eat what the house has made. And it's a very nice restaurant and people are waiting to get in. And there was a long line there. And Peter said, okay, forget it, we'll come back tomorrow and be first in line. And so, these innovative methods of his, kept showing up, and so we did that. Another time in the financial district in London, we went to a pub, and on some rare occasions, Peter would take an alcoholic beverage, which is standard fare for me, but to my surprise, he took a cherry-flavored beer. And I said, this is a bit courageous, for my taste at least, but Peter delved into new things easily. As Carol mentioned, he bought his electric car and loved it, and my wife and I would go in rides with him, and we would observe that he liked to go out of the way to extend the ride because he loved that car so much. He also bought me a gigantic glass of wine that holds a whole bottle of wine in the glass. So I could say that I only had one glass at night. On another occasion, Peter stayed at my house overnight for a joint presentation that we were making in Baltimore the next morning. And Peter was in the shower in my daughter's bedroom, and there were just the two of us at home. And so Peter yelled and said, Dilip, how do you turn on the shower? And I went there, and two of us with 3 PhDs between us could not figure out how to turn the shower on. We gave up, and he took a bath in my bedroom shower. So his spirit will definitely live on in our memories and our lives. And I wish to say many thanks, Peter, for uplifting all the lives you touched so deeply. Thank you.
Since I heard the shocking news, for many nights, I couldn't sleep. My brain was jammed with memories and flashbacks of time together. I wrote something down so that I won't get into a rabbit hole. I'm not good with people. I don't know how to make small talks. But I feel very comfortable with Peter since the very beginning because he's genuine. He doesn't pretend. He has no pretense. And he has no other ulterior motives except the joy of discussing some ideas. And when we're together, he's frank, and sometimes brutally so. But it's because of that brutal frankness that makes our discussions more substantive and more exciting. During the years, I have received the fair share of his brutal comments. I have known that, right? So far, I haven't heard anything new. But I also received many genuine compliments. That's brilliant. That's a genius idea. And I'm so happy I'm going to take you out for lunch. As both of us are devotees of no arbitrage pricing, we both love free lunches from each other. And we do that a lot. Except that Peter is not much of an expert in food or restaurant selection. He's not a gourmet eater, or very picky. So once he was very enthusiastically recommending one place to me, and I went there with him. It's a deli store where you pick food and put it on your plastic box, and you pay by the pound. I don't mind the paying by the pound part, but the food is not appetizing at all, and it doesn't even look clean. So the next time he recommended that place again, I protested strongly, and he was surprised and somewhat offended. Normally, we go along. He said, okay, I'm flexible, so we went to another place. But a couple of weeks later, when we were meeting again, he was laughing. He said, okay, so now I agree you're a better expert than me on food because that place was closed due to health code violations. So he did not pay much attention to food, right? He just wanted to get it over with so that we can continue our discussions of some ideas, right? And he's also very careful in his clothes, right? And even when he's wearing a tie, look at that, right? He's so happy, but his tie is not straight. But there's one thing he's very particular about his clothes, shirts, whether it's long sleeve, short sleeve, or even a t-shirt. It must have a pocket, okay? Because he carries a pencil and razor with him all the time. And in more recent years, he found this erasable ink pen, which is amazing. And he's in love with it. He even gave me one. And he also found a small notebook that he fits into his pocket. Well, I don't have a pocket, but it fits into his pocket. Right? But before he found the notebook that he can carry with him, so we have to find some places where he can write, right? So then we remember this time when we were at Bloomberg, we always go to this Chinese restaurant, Grand Sichuan, in 2nd Avenue and 56th Street. So we go there a lot. And once we were there, we were sort of heavily engaged in discussions, so we sort of forgot our order. And the waitress came and then just felt impatient and left. But the lady left her, is that called the order book? Like the book she wrote things on our table. But we were struggling to write, right? So we were writing on napkins, and it's very hard to write on napkins. So and we saw that book, and Peter grabbed it, tear a couple of pages down, and we started to write. A few minutes later, the waitress came back, and she was horrified, and she had to call her manager because the book has serial numbers, right? So it prevents you from stealing. So we have to give back these several pages. And with the manager write it off, sign off, right? So the waitress didn't steal food. Okay? But a couple of weeks later, we went back again, and the waitress was all smiles. Because now, they learned their lesson. All the tables are covered with white paper cloth, instead tablecloths. And those white papers are so nice. It's thick. It's smooth, you can write on them beautifully. So we had a feast on the paper tablecloth. And I felt lucky, and sometimes I feel also special that Peter found me when I just came out of school. And it had a big impact on my career and my life. But later I realized that I'm not that special, because people would do the same to many, many young researchers. Peter would constantly dig out new kids from everywhere, and he would not only engage them himself, but he would force me to read their papers, talk to them, and set up seminars for them. And I met many young researchers through Peter's introduction. Okay? I first connected with Peter when I just came out of school, knew very little, and maybe only had a couple of working papers. But luckily, I set up a website, and Peter saw it. So he sent me an email saying that, I saw you are working on option pricing. I work in option pricing too. Here's my website. So that's where everything started. A couple of months later, I sent him a working paper, and he invited me to give a talk at Bank of America. Then everything started. Okay. But even though I had nothing, I knew very little at that time, he would still offer so much help and encouragement, make me and later many, many young researchers feel special. Peter has been working in the industry for a long time, and we have this earlier remarks saying how entrepreneurial he is, right? But he surely knows many applications and the importances of various modeling frameworks. And recently, Chris Cohen, a colleague of Peter's at Morgan Stanley, called me. We were commiserating on our loss of Peter. And he was saying, hey, essentially, Peter monitorized this whole quantum stuff because we were there, worked together to monitorize on the convexity of super long-term bonds, where the UK was issuing these 50, 60-year bonds. We worked on that. But amazingly, despite his practical experience and his long tenure in the industry, in our discussions, he rarely let that bind his thinking. So I often say that Peter is more academic than academic. Right? He's not starting with a practical issue. Right? His mind is not bounded. And so when I try to dismiss something by saying, oh, it doesn't make sense at all, he would say, why? Why it doesn't make sense? Right? He's not confused by that. And later I realized that, we stress intuition, but intuition is limited by our own sort of knowledge base. Right? And that's actually where we get started on our first project. It's a bit technical, but what we wanted to do is find a process that can be used to model as a price, let's say security price. That's one thing. That means I need to take expectations, it's finite, price is finite, and so on. Two, we want to make sure that the return distribution stays non-normal as we aggregate over horizons. And that actually turns out to be very hard to do because for many stationary processes, there's so-called central limit theorem, which says that over long aggregation, everything goes to normal. Okay? There's only one class that doesn't do so. That's so-called stable distributions. It doesn't go to normal. The issue with stable is that the variance is infinite, and if you model it for the price goes through the roof. It's explosive. You cannot use it. So I made a comment. I said, Peter, there is actually an exercise in a book. There's a corner solution on this. This stable process, when it's maximally negatively skewed to the left, you could take the expectation. Okay? But it's just so crazy. It's a corner solution, right? So we just cannot use it. He said, why? I said, come on, it just doesn't make sense. It's crazy. Right? I said, why? Have you tested it? Through his insistence, I sort of calmed down. I said, okay, maybe it'll work. If you think about it, it has negative skew, right? It's super stylized and very extreme, but it does have negative skew. It does match one feature of the data. So I calmed down, I set it up, and we tested it. It did match that feature better than any other fancy models. And that's our first work together. Okay. And partially from my training and maybe also personality, I always want to simplify or summarize and extract intuition or common sense from a technical model. But by working with Peter, I realized that many times this so-called common sense or intuition are limited really by our scope or horizon of thinking. If something looks not intuitive or lack of common sense, that something could be wrong, but it also could be that our common sense is too limited. It's limited by our own knowledge base. And Peter's thinking process is not limited by any of these. And many innovative ideas come exactly from this boundless thinking process. And you can see Peter's contribution in many of our joint works when you see we make these seemingly outrageous assumptions, but obtain super sharp results that upon maybe second thought or third thought, you find it actually have nice intuitions and surprisingly strong practical implications. So not only Peter and I felt comfortable with each other, but we also push each other. Our different ways of thinking complement each other and push each other's boundaries. I'm lucky to have Peter with me in my life during the past more than 20 years. I just wish that our time is a little bit longer. Thank you.
I guess some people have really a profound change in one's life, and Peter had a very profound change in my life. I had known Peter as a student of his, then as a colleague and friend. I knew Peter since when I was doing my PhD at Cornell. I took courses under him in advanced financial derivatives. I was a student of computer science, and I basically asked him, after my failed attempt for PhD in electrical engineering subjects, whether he would be willing to serve on my PhD committee, and he agreed. But unfortunately, I didn't pursue that route and left the academia. 1 year later, when I learned that Peter joined Morgan Stanley, I called him up, and basically with a single reference of his, I basically ended up joining Morgan Stanley with great ease. It was as if like Peter said, get him, and I just joined Morgan Stanley. Every time like I had any questions, anything, basically you just ask Peter, and he would help you. He would, such a nice, he had that soul in him. He's such a kind person that, he listens to you for literally like and we were not working together on anything. It was, I never worked with him on any single subject for that matter. But every time I had some question, any technical questions, I go to him, and he would either show me a book, show me some literature, or show me some direction, and it works. I kept, like, Peter was pretty much always there. Like, whenever I was on my down, I was going through a rough time, when he started at NYU London, I was going through my own tough time as well at that time, and I reached out to him, trying to see if, and he suggested that, like, I should teach a course there, and, I liked the idea. I ended up teaching 2 semesters as an adjunct professor, and, it was fun. It was good. It was nice of him to offer me that opportunity. Peter, like, he loved Indian food. I mean, but when you go out with him, when I was at Morgan Stanley, like, you go out for dinner with him, like, he would sweat like crazy. I mean, it was, I didn't never understood why he even ate that food, because, but when I was visiting him for, when he was at NYU London, right, he will go for ice cream. So it was like a very casual person. You talk to him, and in many of the hirings I did in my group at Morgan Stanley, and later on as well, he would refer, he would introduce somebody who is actually a very qualified person. So you don't even need to interview a person when Peter refers, right? You just take him and hire him. So there are many places where I found Peter to be very accessible, very and he never expected anything in return. That was very nice, interesting aspect of his nature. And I was shocked when I learned that this happened. I didn't know how to respond. I wish, like all you guys, like, I wish it was longer. Like, I wish we had more time of his. I'm not going to say much. Thank you.
There are many people speaking, so I'll try to be short and give a few flashbacks. That was in the 90s when Marco Avellaneda and myself were organizing this seminar at Courant Institute. And actually, I spoke with Marco yesterday night because for health reasons he cannot be here, but he told me to insist that he's here by heart and that all the words I'm saying are also in some way coming out of his mouth. It was a very funny ambience during this seminar because we were having speakers who were occasionally from the industry, occasionally from academia, talking models, someone well suited for the market, sometimes not so well suited. There was one Tribullian in the audience, was Nassim Taleb, who was always making the speaker having a hard time. And Marco and myself were trying to explain to the audience that even when it was a theoretical model, it was still making sense, and there was something that people should think about. And that's where I noticed Peter's way of thinking with respect to models, because it was something very surprising, and even we spoke of that a lot with Bruno Dupierre. His approach to modeling, we all always know that a model doesn't fit reality. I mean, there is always something's wrong. There's something, that you need to twist in the model to make it work. And there is this joke, saying that all models are wrong, some are useful. And but Peter, when the model, he had on the one hand some knowledge, some good knowledge of markets, and I learned that a bit later. Many years later, when I learned that prior to all this work that he was essentially working for the sell side, doing option models, in fact, he had a life in the buy side, in the hedge fund industry. I learned that from Shivaji Rao, who worked with him at Susquehanna, and so he had this basic knowledge of trading. At the same time, he had an absolute love for modeling. How do you put that together? And so his approach was not, try to tweak the model. No, when he was seeing something that didn't work, he would expand the model, try to find, a bigger framework. That's exactly the type of mathematical brain, They try to expand the thing so that there is room enough for what you want to say that doesn't fit within that extra model. So he would add dimensions, parameters, try to find, how those things work together. And I remember, for instance, one of the things where we've been working precisely with Marco and myself, etc., he was trying to understand the link between basically the source of the Kolmogorov equation, the link between processes and PDEs. And that was, at the time, he was actually, that went on his side, a lot of work you did with Dilip on the static hedging of barrier options. And at the time I did, it was Bruno's model was the trend. So this local volatility model. And I did a model which actually Nassim hated because he said, that's not the way the work works, etc. Forget about it, do something else. And I was very surprised because I was working at the time at CIBC and the traders were using my model. Until I learned that actually the traders were twisting my model to make it work without telling me. So, and Peter, he was exactly the same thing, he was trying, you see, he was the kind of guy who would never be satisfied. He would ask questions, and why so, and why so, and why so, and why so, until he pushes you to find, some framework. And in some way, it's like his intellectual permanent insatisfaction was really an engine to push to find new things in math finance. And that's all the relation, everything he did also, on value at risk with you, Dilip, on those spectral modeling, spectral measures. That was, it came from, what was the name of French guy, Hassner? I forgot the exact name, of a guy who found that the value at risk that was used by all regulators was not subadditive, so that you could put together different pockets of a portfolio, each of them having a certain level of risk, and when you add up, the risk of the whole was bigger than the sum of the risk of each components. And Peter told me, I mean, it's not satisfactory. We have to use CVAR. And then they went on, with Dilip, and that's where they made the whole theory of the spectral measures, which actually now is fundamentally used by regulators. Another anecdote about that was, so I was having my company Risk Data, which actually, every time I haven't listened to Peter, I lost money. That's simple. One, he proposed to hire me at Bloomberg, and then Bloomberg wanted me I was having my own company, so I had to renounce the shares of my own company. So I said, no, that's not possible. Can I work? No, you cannot do that. And then finally, so I declined the offer that Peter had carved for me. and that was a big mistake. Anyway, one of the big mistakes I did. Another mistake I did that was, within the company, we invented some techniques, to calculate risk, and there was something that was some sort of value at risk, but very specific, using factors. So I call it factor var, but I say factor var, it's not a very trendy, it's a very sexy word. So I called Peter and say, okay, well, Peter, I've invented this method, but how would you call it? And then he think of it. Why don't you call it stress var? Oh yeah, that's a good idea. So we wrote a paper calling stress var, etc. And then we were thinking, within the company, shall we, deposit the name so we keep the IP on the name? No, we have too many IP, expense, etc. So not do it, etc. What happened 6 months later? The regulator with Basel III was naming another risk measure, which they called stress var, which we had protected. We got a lot of money again about it. So the last thing I can say is that he was an amazing Google engine for everything he knew, the entire literature. I've never seen such a guy who knows the entire literature in mathematical finance. Every time, had an idea, etc., I wanted to know whether someone tried to go when that idea is very fuzzy, you get the idea of putting things together. Try to make a search on Google with words that correspond to a very fuzzy idea, crazy thing that you're imagining. Now, the good thing, and I still have Peter's telephone number in my phone here, was to call him. Peter, I had that idea. Yeah, it was published by this guy in the blah, 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 etc. That was Peter. So, that's what I can tell you. He will, we'll miss him, but at the same time, the message I want to say is let's keep, more what we remember from him rather than what we miss him. This thing of being permanently unsatisfied, always questioning. It's not, there is nothing that, where you have you have an answer, not a single answer is really fully satisfactory. There is always questions, and he was permanently questioning. And that was, how I think we should do science in general. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'm here to represent the academic friends of Peter Carr. First of all, I'd like to say that this picture, from an academic standpoint, is a perfect remembrance of Peter Carr. He's standing in front of books, and he's wearing a tie. And, he always wore a tie. The only time I saw him without a tie was Christmas dinner. For him, wearing a tie was the most natural thing in the world, or so it seemed to me. It was like a uniform, I guess. Dilip Madan proved that you can work at Morgan Stanley without wearing a tie. So obviously it's optional, right? And the same with Bruno Dupier. You can work at Bloomberg without wearing a tie. But Peter, always a tie. So I just want to give, and always books, I just want to give a few. Of course, nowadays, if he'd lived a little longer, all his books may have been on his hard drive, right? Because they're easier to travel with. You know, you don't need 4 suitcases full of books. But anyway, to me, Peter Carr was always a symbol that was unique. I had PhD students, lots of them, who wanted to work in industry. Because you got a PhD, you can get a nice job, if you're lucky, in industry. And they told me they wanted to continue to do research while working in industry. And I would say to them, well, that's possible. I have one example. There's one person who's been able to do that. It must not be that easy, you know. And that, of course, was Peter Carr. And he, when I've had a long career, as you can tell by my hair and my appearance. And I spent many years in Indiana at Purdue University. And that's where I started working on mathematical finance as a research topic. And even though I was a mathematician at the time, I say mathematician at the time because after Purdue, I went to Cornell, where I was an engineer, and now I'm at Columbia, where I'm a statistician. Which shows that, you know, if you pay me, I'll do what you're doing, you know. But in any event, at Purdue, I wanted to establish my credentials as somebody in finance, and unwittingly, Peter invited me to give a talk at Merrill Lynch, which immediately established my credentials, at least in my mind. I don't know if anyone else cared. I moved from Purdue to Cornell in the year 2000, and because I was an engineer, I had to do something called the projects course. And the projects course meant that I had somebody from industry, which meant the Wall Street, had to propose a question that he or she, but it was always he, didn't know the answer to, right? And wanted our help. So it was like free consulting, free painful consulting for the researcher. And the researcher would provide data, and then we would analyze it and come up with a model that would explain the data. So I knew nobody on Wall Street, and so I went to my colleague Bob Jarrow, who was very helpful, and he only had 2 words, Peter Carr. I said, well, of course. So I called up Peter Carr and asked if he would give me things for sponsors, and he did, and he found me other people to continue doing it. And non-trivial people like Ali Hirsa, who will speak today. I mean, really good people. So he was a huge help to me. And then when I moved to Columbia in 2011, Peter Carr was the first and so far the only person who invited us, my wife and daughter and myself, to his home for Christmas dinner. Well, I'm Jewish, so, you know, having Christmas dinner is really not that big a thing for me. But I was very impressed, and we had a great time. And then, of course, we started a mathematical finance seminar as soon as I got to Columbia. And so obviously we invited Peter Carr to give a talk, because you don't just want everybody from academia to give a talk, you want somebody from industry to give a talk. And if you're looking at industry, well, there's Peter Carr. And so we invited Peter Carr to give a talk, and he did. And then he took us, well, we took him, but to his favorite Upper East Side restaurant, which was the first time that I had wonderful food on the Upper East Side, which I mean, it's not such a big accomplishment, but it was just a delightful time at his restaurant. He was treated very nicely, so it was obvious that he was not a stranger to this restaurant. And what I'll always remember about Peter more than anything else, was that it was the spirit of generosity and welcome. You know, you move to a new city and you're immediately invited to somebody's home. You're not just invited to somebody's home, you're invited to somebody's home for Christmas dinner, which is really meaningful when you're Jewish. And he was always generous. So I didn't know that it was going to be the end of his life, and I don't think he did either. But I have a really talented PhD student, a woman, Alejandra Quintos Lima, from Mexico, and and so I mentioned to Peter that I have this student, and he said, well, she should apply to Tandon, and then he invited her to give a seminar, which she did, and he wasn't at the seminar, which was absolutely unthinkable for Peter. And then I got an email from Dilip explaining what was going on. So right up to the end, he was generous and welcoming and wanted to help young people continue.
It is a true testament to Peter's life that the stories that are being shared this morning are so rich and full. We're going to ask the next collection of speakers to get ready. And we're also going to ask, if possible, that you would limit your remarks to 1 to 2 minutes. So, if Roger Lee, AJ Khanna, Ali Hirsa, Dan Stefanica, and Bruno DePierre, please.
Peter's exuberant energy and amazing generosity and boundless creativity and transcendent, enduring insights will continue to warm my heart and illuminate our paths in the profession and elevate our spirits for all the years to come. Thank you to Peter's family and Carol and Olivia for sharing him with us. We know how much music meant to him. I don't know whether he liked a band called The Bravery, but their lyrics express my thoughts to Peter. All that I can think to say is, I'll be with you every day. Not even earth can hold us. Not even life controls us. Not even the ground can keep us down. The memories in my head are just as real as the time we spent. You'll always be close to me, my friend. This is not the end.
Well, I had a kind of written speech running across a few pages. Let me try and be a bit like Peter and be creative here. So, a lot's been said about Peter, and I think one aspect of his, which I thought was probably the most important to this field, was that he was a bridge for so many engineers, physicists, computer science, math types, people who had great quant skills and experience, but were struggling to enter the financial world, either because they didn't know the finance, arbitrage arguments, or because they had a lack of contacts and didn't know the lay of land. Many got started in the field with a selfless assist from Peter. Peter must have mentored tens of young professionals. And I know that because in my time at various jobs at Wall Street, I had the opportunity to meet very many young quants, and nearly all of them had a story or two to tell about how Peter helped them and gave them a start in the field. Peter was brilliant, and he had a passion for people and ideas. And, his generosity with his encyclopedic knowledge and vast connections made him Google before Google and LinkedIn before LinkedIn. He was the best kind of teacher. He led by example. And because of all the connections he created and fostered at this very human level, he left an indelible mark in the field where now there's a Peter-shaped hole we will now have to fill with memories. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I've had known Peter since '96. I was introduced to him through my PhD advisor, Professor Madan. I had the pleasure of working with him in his group, writing papers, articles, attending more than 30 conferences in 14 cities over 9 countries. At the start of each conference, he would come to me and would ask, shall we go running early morning or before dinner? He was truly my running mate. He was not necessarily a good dancer. You guys are on my wedding, as I recall. But you should have seen him on the ice rink. My son and I ran into Peter and Olivia 10 years ago at the Lasker rink, north of Central Park. He could really dance on the ice. I went to him and asked, Peter, I didn't know you can skate so beautifully. And he replied, what do you expect? I'm Canadian. I would never forget the excitement in his face. Anytime he would learn a new mathematical trick or would see an interesting math problem. I actually came up with a few of them, resembling a face of a kid seeing ice cream or a chocolate. That's the way Peter was. Those they knew Peter knew about his love for books. Carol mentioned, massive collection of them, the so-called Peter's Library, and it would be impossible not to find what you needed in his books, in his library. One last thing, Sandip already stole this from me, his love for spicy food. To Peter, food would not be spicy enough if we didn't sweat. And he loved it, truly he loved it. Just finish it up, aside from his being brilliant, aside from his significant contribution to the field, he was genuine, gentle, and many, as you mentioned, generous, very kind. He was always willing to help, a true mentor, a great teacher. You didn't need to know him for long to know this about him. These are the traits that you will see at day one. He touched so many hearts, had a huge impact on lots of people's career path, including myself. And the last thing was, when we came up with the title of one of our papers, Why Be Backward, he looked at me and said, because I'm always a forward-looking guy. God bless his soul.
While thinking about how to honor Peter's memory today, I realized that what Peter would have really liked us to do was to take out a napkin and start working on some problems. Well, of course, we cannot do that, but that's what Peter would have loved us to do. Peter was unique. I always thought of Peter as simultaneously being the best academic in industry and the best practitioner in academia, and I'm very happy that I told him that repeatedly. His moving seamlessly from industry to academia only made this more obvious. He once again, at the same time, became the best practitioner in academia and the best academic in industry. Peter and I met more than 20 years ago at a seminar at Baruch. After the seminar, we ended up working with Luren on the board on an alternative solution to one of the results he presented. And that was just a constant when meeting Peter. Every time we met, we ended up doing math. I did mention napkins in the beginning. They were the primary medium for doing math in our meetings. We never went to that restaurant where they had paper on the table. Since boards are scarcely available at restaurants, they were there at Bloomberg though. And that happened constantly. Peter and I met once over lunch when he was at Bloomberg. And for the first time ever, he was not smiling. He just sat down, looked at me for like 10 seconds, then he said, "Dan, you have no idea how lucky you are not to have a boss." Clearly, that was a difficult day at work. Well, by the end of the lunch, we were doing math on napkins, and Peter was happy again. Because talking math and working on problems with others always made Peter happy. As I was preparing to say some words here, I realized that the first blurb on the back of my first book is from Peter. I was very flattered when he volunteered to do that, and now it will be there forever. And speaking of forever, Olivia, this is a grievous loss. But please keep in mind that everyone in here and everyone else who is on Zoom are friends, and nothing would make us happier than to help you. So please keep in mind that for anything that you would need help and support with, there is a friend of Peter who will gladly provide it for you and in Peter's honor. Peter, may you rest in peace. We will honor your memory and we will take care of everything in your absence.
So indeed, it's very sad, so sad, and so Carol and Olivia, so we're sharing, and the rest of the family, we're sharing your pain, but beyond grieving the loss, we should also remember and appreciate the privilege that we had to interact with Peter and all what he gave us. We are partly shaped by the people we interact with. And actually, I think that for many of us, Peter has revealed the better part in us. His benevolence was contagious, and actually, in some sense, is passing it, chopping a part of us, the better part of us. For me personally, I felt very close to Peter. In some sense, he was almost close to being a twin. We were born a couple of weeks apart. We married 1 week apart, and I've been knowing him for 30 years. And at Bloomberg for 6 years, I've spent every day in front of him. Typically, the day was starting in the morning with 1 or 2 hours where he was sharing his ideas of the night, and we were debating at length. It was always very, very instructive. I've been co-teaching for several years also at NYU with him. We were in the World Quant University Advisory Board and sharing many different activities. So today, it's an opportunity to thank you, Peter. Thank you. So in the name of the community and in my own name, thank you for all what you gave, for the connecting so many people, generating and sharing so many ideas, encouraging junior and older people, inspiring the whole community and creating so many joyous moments. In the south of France, we say that people die twice. First, when they pass away. Second, when they are forgotten. I'm sure he will not die twice. So let's hope that this terror shock will remind us to express love and care to the people that matter to us before it's too late.
My name is Cindy, and I'm the director of the National Museum of Mathematics. And I first met Peter almost exactly 12 years ago to the day. The museum didn't exist yet, but we had built a traveling exhibit of mathematics called the Math Midway. And Peter accepted an invitation from a group of strangers to come and see the exhibition. Less than 1 week later, we were already having conversations about whether Peter might join our board. He was described as having been highly engaged with the exhibit, pointing out numerous mathematical connections of the exhibits and recommending and thinking about other exhibits that we might build. He recommended a couple of books to us, but he did more than that. He took the trouble to order those books and to have them delivered. And that was Peter. He was always quietly doing things that he thought might make a difference. Within 3 weeks of that first meeting, Peter's name was being officially brought up to the board. A month later, as we were struggling to find the 60 volunteers we needed to man our exhibit at the World Science Festival, Peter came up with an idea that was so ingenious that he emailed me a question. At what point do you think we might have too many volunteers? And just 3 months after we first met, Peter was unanimously elected to the Board of Trustees of the National Museum of Mathematics. About a year later, when he received an award as the Financial Engineer of the Year, he referred back to our first meeting at the Math Midway exhibition. But he didn't speak about his own experience. He spoke about his daughter, Olivia's experience. I'm sure that I won't say this as eloquently as he did that day, but he told the assembled audience that he had seen too many little girls who loved math slowly get turned off to it, and he had joined the Board of Mathematics, the Board of the Museum of Math, to find a way to make sure that those little girls turned into women who felt welcome in the world of math. As a woman leading an organization in a field predominated by men, I found Peter's support simply remarkable. When he moved to Morgan Stanley, he invited me to speak to a group of young women at their annual Women's Mentorship event. And I was invited back again and again. And it was clear that Peter Carr was no stranger to the women in that room. And when I faced obstacles in my own career, Peter was there, a cheerleader behind the scenes whose words of support kept me going. As a trustee, Peter was never the loudest voice in the boardroom. He was one of those people who didn't have to be loud, because when he did speak, people listened. Peter's role went well beyond the boardroom. He was a person who always took the time to say thank you. He noticed and appreciated everything. In a world where we are all too busy doing too many things for too many hours, Peter made me feel like my efforts mattered. I'm quite sure I'm not the only one who felt that way about him. Over time, Peter became more than a colleague. He became a friend. Years ago, he and his family came to my daughter's bat mitzvah, driving to the eastern end of Long Island to celebrate with us. And when that same daughter, many years later, was an applied math major looking for a summer internship, Peter was more than happy to give advice. I remember him telling me that the most important thing in landing a good internship was passion, and that my daughter should figure out what interested her and then excel in it. I think Peter could have been describing himself with that comment. He was keenly interested in mathematics, and as you've heard from all of the people speaking before me, he truly excelled at it. But Peter excelled at something else as well. He loved to find simple explanations for complicated mathematical topics. I recall when one of our trustees, who's not a mathematician, was seeking an explanation for something called Euler's identity. And he'd been asking everyone, but it wasn't until he asked Peter that he received a response that satisfied. Peter was a patient and gifted teacher, finding ways to share complicated topics in understandable terms. It is with that in mind that I'm pleased to announce a lecture that MoMath will host in Peter's honor. Dubbed Simplify, the lecture will honor Peter's memory by doing exactly what he loved to do, finding a way to simplify a mathematical topic so that it can be understood and appreciated by all. Thanks to the many donations that we have received in Peter's memory, we will be able to make this an annual lecture for at least the next 2 years. And that book that Peter sent us 12 years ago, it was a book including something called Proofs Without Words. These are images that convey mathematical truths so eloquently and so beautifully that no words are needed. It is my hope that in the future Museum of Math, we will have a gallery of proofs without words. And I know that if we do, I will feel Peter's spirit every time I walk by them. I'd like to close by reading an excerpt from a board resolution that was passed by the Board of Trustees at a meeting earlier this week. Resolved that the trustees of the Board of the National Museum of Mathematics mourn the passing of Peter Carr, celebrate his life, and express their deep gratitude for the service, vision, and leadership he brought to the museum and the broader mathematical community during his time as trustee. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jelena Kovacevic. I'm the Dean of Tandon, not the boss, but a colleague of Peter's. I'm speaking here on behalf of NYU, especially of the NYU Tandon School of Engineering and Peter's Department, Finance and Risk Engineering, to express our deepest condolences to Carol and Olivia and the entire family. There are many who have expressed what Peter meant to us and what a tremendous hole his passing will leave in all our hearts. I'll be really brief because I would like to give opportunity to those who loved him so much and spent so much time with him to speak. I just want to personally say, another woman in math, that in my interactions with Peter, echoes of what everybody has said were really evident. He was really funny and he was whimsical. We shared the love of math. We would exchange math gems, and many people have said what a twinkle in his eye he would have when he would see something that he didn't know before. We also love electronic gadgets, so I was really tickled when I read it in the obituary that that was something that was known to many. And at the risk of embarrassing Olivia, our daughters, nothing really embarrassing. We just talked about you and my daughter and exchanged ideas and how amazing and amazing women you both became. We will miss you, Peter, and we really wanted more of you too. Thank you.
So we are the Finance and Risk Engineering Department at Tandon, and only some will be able to speak. We want to be mindful of time.
On paper, Peter was my boss, but in life, he was so much more than that to me. He was a friend, a mentor, and truly was my biggest supporter. We worked together for about a decade, first at Morgan Stanley and later at NYU. To find the right words or stories to do justice to a soul like Peter's is really an impossible task. I have so many fond memories of Peter. When we were at Morgan Stanley, we would go on recruiting trips together, using Peter's math fame to lure in the best quant students into our programs. Peter loved to come to the LA trips so that he could visit his parents while we were there. No matter how much money Peter made or how much recognition or fame he got in the quant world, one thing that I loved about Peter was that nothing was ever beneath him. I distinctly remember us having catering and pizza delivered to UCLA and him literally stacking like tons of pizzas on his arms, carrying them into UCLA, and us just like cracking up about it. He was always there to lend a helping hand whenever I needed it, both literally and figuratively. I love to hear Peter's stories, and it turns out that story about him being a chauffeur for the blind woman was definitely a fan favorite because I was going to speak about that today, so we'll cross that off and I'll keep it extra short for you all. But that really was the best story. However, in my version, it was a man. So it's a good thing that you told it because that just goes to show how the game of telephone works. Peter truly was a light in my life and most everyone's life that knew him. Peter saw the absolute best in every single person that knew him, and he gave everybody the benefit of the doubt. It really didn't matter whether you were a managing director at a global bank or a student who just finished their bachelor's degree and wanted to pursue a master's degree at Tandon. He gave everyone the same level of respect and treated everybody exactly the same as everyone else. And I think that's a really, really rare quality that I'll really miss. It's hard to find the light in unexpected and unfair losses like the loss of Peter. Over the last couple weeks, though, I've really found a lot of peace and joy in reading the stories about how many lives he touched. And not only just touched, but he actually changed so many lives, and I'm sure many of the lives in this room. To leave behind a legacy like this is something really, really special. They really don't make them any better than Peter. And if you were lucky enough to know Peter, you truly were lucky enough. Peter, if you're here today, which I believe you are, thank you for being one of the most supportive people in my life, for always believing in me and being the best boss that I've ever had. You've made a place for me at NYU and really changed my life, and for that I'm forever grateful. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Zathra Patterson. I'm the program manager in FRE, and I was fortunate enough to work very closely with Peter on the BQE lecture series, the departmental newsletter, and special events. Peter cared deeply about the department, his entire staff, every faculty member, student, alumni, and our rankings. Under Peter's strong leadership, FRE thrived. Peter was never in a bad mood. In fact, he always had that smile on his face, a funny story to tell, or to give an update about Brooklyn's ever-changing landscape. He became my personal cheerleader when I graduated from NYU Steinhardt. He made us all feel special and a part of something truly special. No matter how busy Peter was, he always took time to say, thank you. In one of our last email exchanges, I asked what he needed from me for an upcoming grad admissions event, and Peter said, just your incredible EQZ. That made Peter truly special to me. Peter stood up for his staff members whenever we encountered problems on campus. He was always ready to send an email, make that phone call, or schedule a meeting. Not only did Peter stand up for me on occasions, but when Peter learned that my son was a victim of a gang assault that left him blind in his right eye, Peter wanted to help in ways that I'll never forget. I am eternally grateful to Peter, who showed compassion to my son, whom he'd never met, but wanted to see justice finally prevail. Peter will be missed beyond measure. We heard this tune earlier, but I want to dedicate a few lines from the Beatles song. There are places I'll remember all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone and some remain. Peter, you will remain in our hearts forever, and your legacy will live on in FRE. Our lives are forever changed for the better because of your vision, trust, and kind spirit. Thank you for always making me feel seen, heard, and valued. Rest in eternal peace. ZP.
I'm Carmen Montes de Oca. I work with Peter very closely over the past 6 years. My colleague James here is kind to give my remarks because I'm too overcome.
I'm going to read her remarks first, and I have a few things to say myself. So from Carmen, she says, I worked closely with Peter for the past 6 years since he joined Tandon. His absence is deeply felt in the office and in our lives. Not only was he the best boss, he was also kind and caring. I will always be grateful to have had the honor of working for a brilliant person as he was. He made my life better and the lives of so many others, lucky enough to have known him. My favorite memories of Peter are too many to recount. He will be greatly missed but never forgotten. His legacy will stay with us in our hearts and minds. May he rest in peace, and may we all find comfort in our treasured memories of our time with Peter. So for me, I worked with Peter as his IT manager. And given his love for electronic devices, it should be no surprise that we became fast friends. We spent a lot of hours talking about gadgets, and I feel like I have to apologize to Carol for that because I was sort of an enabler for that kind of thing. I don't remember the amount of times I volunteered to help him at his house with a new gadget because it was just something new and cool. So if you ever need help with that smart soap dispenser, I'm there. The only thing to match Peter's brilliance and intelligence was his warmth, his kindness, and his generosity. I can't imagine a single person that had him in his life that hasn't been improved by his efforts and his presence. I mourn his loss deeply, and I wish I had more time, but I will be forever grateful for the time that we had. Thank you.
I'm Leon Tadavosian. When I got getting to the subway today at East 42nd Street, I saw a guy with a hockey stick getting on the train with me, and I said, it's Peter's magic making its presence felt. Peter and I met in the mid-1990s when he was at Morgan Stanley. I had worked there from '89 to '92, and a colleague of his, whom I knew from MS, introduced us. I think this was at an NYU event. Soon after that, the first of the many seminar and conference presentations given by our friend Peter that I attended took place. I've talked to many professional colleagues over these last weeks. All of us have remarked about Peter's wonderful talent for and dedication to clear exposition. His PowerPoint slides were a work of art. How did Peter reach that perfect balance? Each page had the right amount of content. The theme of the talk was always visible, and you saw how it all fit together beautifully. The drill down into each detail came at just the right point. How did he pull that off each time? As you got to know Peter, you learned that this skill at explanation was a singular part of his personality. He loved his subject and loved equally the chance to share its ideas, how some are intuitive and how some are non-intuitive. And this he did with the most amazing modesty, and with those just learning the subject, infinite patience. My brother Armand, who's here today, who knew Peter longer than I did, having met him in 1990, told me about sharing a meal with Peter and Carol and Olivia in a Montauk restaurant in 2019. There was another patron in the restaurant, and somehow Armand found out that this person was a finance student. Armand mentioned this to Peter and Carol. After a while, Armand left the table for a bit. When he returned, he saw Peter explaining an idea or formula to this person using a paper napkin as paper. I say with 99% confidence that the math finance on a paper napkin trick was on display in every meal I enjoyed with my beloved friend. Peter was fond of classifying finance quants as either P quants or Q quants. The P quants work with the real world or physical probabilities of market outcomes, extrapolating these probabilities from past behavior and possibly economic models. The Q quants, however, are in the derivatives land under assumptions that ensure hedging They invoke adjusted probabilities, the Q measure, to price derivatives and impute exotic derivative prices from the price of standard ones. I picture clearly this scenario. Peter explaining this P versus Q characterization with his usual limitless enthusiasm to a group of students, with me off to the side, absorbing it and thinking, how clever, I'm gonna use that myself. And when I think about it, that scenario represents one of the many, many situations in which Peter's brilliance and deep knowledge made an impact and continue to make an impact on me. For many parts of mathematical finance, Peter was my go-to person for questions. I would send an email, and he would write back, often very quickly, with a reformulation. He loved to engage you. It was sometimes a bit intimidating because Peter would explain gently that focusing on my original question was leaving out a much more interesting and consequential, bigger story. And I think to myself, boy, there's a lot that I don't know. That's one of my fondest memories. Carol and Peter, I loved your dad and your husband, truly remarkable person. Farewell, my friend. It was an honor to be your friend and colleague.
My name is John Hill. I worked with Peter at Morgan Stanley when I first joined in 2010, around the same time that he did. I was running a model validation team, so I didn't work in Peter's group, but at a certain point, he invited me to give a seminar on the history of model risk, which is my area of specialty, for a weekly seminar series that he sponsored at Morgan Stanley. And so I did, and whatever I said, and I don't remember too much about it, it stuck with him, because in 2019, after he became head of FRE, he called me up and asked me if I'd be interested in teaching a model risk management class at NYU Tandon for his department, because nobody was ever teaching this subject in academia. So he gave me the opportunity to teach the very first graduate level course in model risk management, which I accepted. When I was talking to him, though, he mentioned a detail from my presentation, which 7 years earlier, which really surprised me, something about something called the Coriolis effect. If you're not a physicist, you wouldn't know what that means, but the British Navy nearly lost a major engagement because they bungled calculation of something called the Coriolis force. 7 years later, he still remembered that detail. He said it had stuck with him, and that ends up why he ended up reaching out to me to teach a class in model risk. During that course, I invited the head of model risk management at Wells Fargo to come as a guest lecturer, and he and a colleague were very excited to meet Peter because they knew him by reputation, but they'd never met him. So I arranged for a meeting with Peter and the three of us in his office. And during that meeting, I remember mentioning that as part of model validation, in model validation, we try to break models. We try to make them misbehave. And I had managed to break a model and get it to produce negative probabilities, which is an impossibility. There's no such thing as a negative probability. At least that's what I said. But it's so typical of Peter that he would leap from the known and understood into very effortlessly into that which is not understood. And he said, no, it's quite possible to have negative probabilities. And he proceeded to give this exposition on a parallel universe that can be defined in a complex plane in which negative probabilities could actually occur. And I noticed, though, he had a mischievous twinkle in his eye the whole time he was giving this exposition. It was completely ad hoc, and it was brilliant. But I couldn't decide if he was having me on or he was really serious about negative probabilities. Ever since, I've been searching for that parallel universe where negative probabilities may exist. I have been able to find it, but I have a feeling that Peter may have found his way there. Thank
you. Hello everyone. My name is Sapawit Naguri, and I first met Professor Carr back in October 2020. I worked there as a student in Master of Financial Engineering program at Tandon. We usually have a bi-weekly meeting together with him and with some other students in leadership teams as well. I remember very well for every moment that I have with him. I remember how nervous I was before talking to a celebrity like him, and that happens to everyone, I guess. And when everything turns to the opposite, when his friendliness and his sense of humor coming to the show. His laughing, his big smiles, and the stories always come from the corner, never died out the conversation. And one of my favorite part about in every meeting is he always turned the student meeting into the mathematical lectures, which was very, very fun to all of us, and it was very inspiring to all of us. I also remember me and another friend, we asked him what his favorite book is, and the answer that I got from him is a stochastic calculus book. We didn't expect that at all, but it's not a big surprise for us. Talking about his accomplishment in the financial industry, he was one of the biggest legendary and a brilliant mind. But to me, he's more than that. He is all a definition of the real life role model to me. He makes me want to grow up to be a great leader like him. He is a type of leader who gives opportunity to people and a type of leader who treated everyone the same regardless of what level they are. He dedicated teaching me and allowed me to work on a research paper with him. And even though he knows that I would most of the time sit there and listen to him talking all the time. He's the very first person who gave me an opportunity in quantitative journey. And I would never forget thinking about him in every success and accomplishment that I have in the future. So today, I hope that I'm here not to only share my personal tribute, but I really hope that my eulogy represented a lot of students' feeling, a lot of people that he has touched about the loss. Although some of us might not have worked with him as closely as I do in the past, but we all feel the same. We all feel about the loss, and we all feel very thankful for everything that he has done to us, to the society, and to our program. It brought a lot of opportunities in both academia and career. And lastly, my heart is all with his family. So thank you for always welcoming us to join the hockey night with him. And he mentioned it to me a couple of times, like the story that he met a beautiful lady who became his wife, exactly the same word, a lot of times. And he always mentioned to me that he promised to take his wife for dinner, and I think sometimes around Tuesday, 6 p.m. And I think that is a very sweet side of him. And also he spoke it out loud about his daughter when you had a very good grades in the school in front of the students. So MSFE at Tandon would never be the same, but it will keep growing up as his legacy will continue. We will make him proud, as he always mentioned about his successful students in the industry, and we will come that point one day to make him proud. Thank you so much.
Oh, please. I'm so sorry.
Good afternoon. I'm Jimin Yu. I work for Peter at Morgan Stanley. So firstly, my deepest condolences to Carol and Peter's family. Peter has made Peter rest in peace. And the news, when it reached me, was very sudden, like I couldn't believe in the first few days. So Peter was the greatest mentor to me. He was actually my manager's manager at Morgan Stanley because he was the global head of market modeling. But he actually directly worked with me on a regular basis, like equals, and have learned a great deal amount from him. Our work culminated in a paper published on the topic of intense interest in both industry and academia, under his guidance and his drive to produce something out of our work. He subsequently helped me further develop and expand my career by introducing me to crucial people and also giving me the precious opportunity to work for another team to expand my horizons in mathematical finance. So after a few years at Morgan Stanley, I wished to transition to a different type of job, another business. He was very understanding, and he gave me all the help and green lights along the entire way, and helped me again in 2018 when I was looking for a job after Morgan Stanley. So all above are not what usual managers of managers do. Peter has really gone above and beyond to help me in any way he can. I owe him a tremendous amount, and actually most of my professional career to him. And this is not with exaggeration at all. And there are numerous other ways that Peter helped me by trying to help me to achieve more. He took me to conferences on mathematical finance a few times, and during our work, meals, and seminars, he provided me with the opportunities to meet with quite a few crucial researchers in both academia and industry. He's the role model as an advisor and a mentor to me. After Morgan Stanley, it was great to hear that he became the chair of the Department of Finance and Risk Engineering at NYU Tandon. We have kept in touch, and I have watched some of his videos on LinkedIn and browsed through his new papers since then. I cannot really say I understand really them because his papers are very deep. I also distinctly remember I briefly chatted with him last Christmas, and he mentioned a few papers related to the work that's in the TV series by some mathematical finance professor. That was like yesterday, but yeah. I also want to mention when I was interviewing with Morgan Stanley 12 years ago, I was thrilled to learn that Peter was the global head of the group I was interviewing with. He has been a legend in both the industry and academia, even that time, like more than 10 years ago. And he has been one of my idols I have long admired, even in my graduate school days. And he was truly very nice and talked to me like equals in the interviews. I was a little nervous, and I have always looked up to him, including now and forever. It was my great honor to have the opportunity to work for him and have had him as my mentor. Peter will be forever remembered. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorenzo. I come from Italy. I am a colleague and friend of Peter. I met him in 2019 during a conference in Perugia. When I just asked him a question during his talk, he apparently liked it, so he got back in touch. And we have been talking online every Tuesday ever since. I never met him in person again, and I do regret it. Mostly our conversation were about work, but there was a lot of space for casual chat, general intellectual debate, which was enlightening, just the same. I will cherish those moments for the rest of my life. The atmosphere was always relaxed and informal, and despite the great insight on a large number of topics I have always gained by talking to him, our conversations always had more the feeling of a friendly weekly catch-up than that of a research meeting. This was, to me, his greatness. The way I knew him was that of a light-spirited, enthusiastic person who loved his job to the bone, but without being overwhelmed by it. And he was, to me, such an incredibly kind and generous person. I feel I owe him much, and I wasn't able to repay him somehow, but then again, deep down, I know that this is a wrong thought, and because what he did for me really was just for the sake of giving. If further proof is needed of how charismatic and kind Peter was, just look at me. I really only met him once, and yet here I am celebrating his memory. All I really need to say, all I came here to say today is thank you. Thank you, Peter, for sharing with me your exceptional ideas. Your brilliance has motivated me in my work like nothing did before. Thanks for putting in me a degree of trust and belief I never have imagined somebody could have. Thank you, Peter, for giving me the self-confidence of pushing forward with my plans and projects, even when I was doubting myself. Thanks for having unquestionably been, in these 2 years, the colleague who most supported me and believed in my potential. Thank you, Peter, for being such an inspiration to me and to me as well as many others. Thank you, Peter, for being an exemplary professional, scholar, and colleague. You might not have fulfilled your lifetime ambition of a perfect American option formula, but you have given us so much more. Thank you, Peter.
It is clear from this eulogy, from all these good words, that Peter was well loved. We had hoped to open the floor up for some other voices, but I'm going to invite you to share any further thoughts with Carol and Olivia at the reception that will be held next door. At this moment, I invite you to receive these words from the poet Mary Oliver. This poem from her is called In Blackwater Woods. Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds. And every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this, the fires and the black river of loss whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do 3 things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. We'll have a moment of silence. Let us pray. Beloved community, there is no rehearsal for either death or grief that would make the sting of Peter's passing any less heavy. Also, there are no words sufficient to communicate the sorrow that those who love him feel at this time of loss. There are not words to assuage the pain that his absence creates, and yet still we pray. We pray because what we have to extend and offer with complete confidence is this: the unassailable promise of our faith, which says, I will not leave you comfortless. We believe there is a spirit that is ever present, and it shows up in community. We believe there is a living promise of comfort and peace and strength, and it shows up in community. May that same spirit lavishly give you, Carol and Olivia, and all those who loved Peter, love. And may the prayers of this gathered community and the support of all who knew Peter and hold him in blessed memory. And with complete confidence, we entrust you, all of Peter's loved ones, and all your days ahead, to the all-sufficient one who can and will do what no one else can do. Keep you from falling, bottle your tears, and cradle your hearts. This is our prayer today. and in the days that lie ahead. And we pray in the name of love, faith, and community. Amen. And now as we prepare to leave this place again, and I said the reception will be in the chapel out these doors and to the left, please receive this blessing that comes from what you all shared here today. You said of Peter that he expanded the model, that he sought people out. He was a connector, an uplifter. He questioned and he laughed. He was generous and welcoming. He was a bridge. He was a teacher and a mentor. He liked his food a little spicy. And he was a cheerleader. So the blessing for you today, and I invite you to open your hands and your hearts as you receive it, is to go out into the world and be like Peter. Amen.